Hello and welcome to today's webinar, an EdTPA Preview Orientation. My name is Tracy Vasquez and I am here at Grand Canyon University in Phoenix, Arizona in the College of Education, Office of Clinical Practice. We are recording today's webinar, so my voice, the slides, as well as any vocal participants' information will be recorded. Currently, all attendees are muted, and that is to help eliminate background noise. However, if you do have a question or a comment throughout the presentation, please feel free to raise the hand icon or type in the questions box below, and I will do my best to address your questions throughout the presentation. This EdTPA preview orientation is intended to be a very brief overview to give you a general idea of what is expected for the EdTPA portfolio. And if you're listening to this preview orientation, likely you are from the states of Georgia, New York, or Wisconsin, as those are the only states that are going to be utilizing the EdTPA portfolio during student teaching. So we'll go ahead and get started. Today's topics and objectives, we will be discussing a few certification rules. EdTPA as a requirement as in professional knowledge assessment. Briefly discussing the components of EdTPA. And discussing for you as GCU candidates how you can familiarize yourself with available resources, develop a plan of action, and complete your EdTPA acknowledgement. So the way EdTPA has come to be a requirement is through its categorization as a content pedagogy assessment. So we know as we prepare to be educators, there are many different types of assessments required. Typically, they come in the form of exams. We've heard of basic skills exams, content exams, and professional knowledge exams. Professional knowledge exams test your content pedagogy. So for your particular state, pedagogy is assessed not through an exam, but through a portfolio. And EdTPA is a portfolio that's currently being used to assess this pedagogical knowledge. So as you work to complete this portfolio called the EdTPA, you will be demonstrating knowledge of your teaching pedagogy. You'll have to submit video and written reflections as evidence for student learning. And they're mainly concerned here with the learning of your classroom students that you're working with as a student teacher. So you do have to complete your EdTPA portfolio while you are in your student teaching placement. You have to collect all of that evidence that you need, video and written reflections. And when you're done with student teaching, you've compiled your entire portfolio, you submit it for scoring, and it is scored through a national website using national standards. So here are just a few basics for EdTPA. It's called a student-centered multiple measure assessment of teaching. And what that means is the focus of EdTPA is on the classroom students. They want to ensure student teachers are effective working with classroom students and the students are learning. So that's why it's called a student-centered measure. It's a multiple measure assessment because there's multiple aspects of your teaching and the students' learning that are analyzed. It isn't just looking at one piece of your teaching, it's looking at multiple aspects of your teaching. And we can see that because just as you're graded on a rubric for many of your LoudCloud assignments throughout your program, there's rubrics incorporated throughout the EdTPA portfolio assessment where you can see all of the measures that are used to evaluate your work. So it is a benefit that you have access to those rubrics prior to your submission. And we know that teacher candidates in Georgia, New York, and Wisconsin are required to take and pass the EdTPA. And it does have to be completed for these states because it is a state requirement for certification. It is not a requirement set by GCU. It's something that was determined to be a requirement by those individual states prior to certification. So we know that EdTPA does have to be completed while you're in your student teaching placement. That means all of the evidence that you need for this portfolio must be accumulated while you are in your student teaching placement. There will be no additional opportunities to collect this evidence. So, how do I complete EdTPA? You will be following the national standards and you will be scored through a national website. And I'm going to be providing you a bit more detail about the assessments and how you complete those expectations. So let's get down to the assessments. So these assessments, they really have shifted the definition of effective teaching. Whereas previously, teachers were expected to successfully deliver the curriculum and would make statements such as, "We got through the material." Now, teachers and student teachers are expected to have a positive impact on student learning and reflect in ways such as, how have I affected student learning? So as a teacher candidate at GCU, you really need to be thinking about how you would respond to a question like this. How have I affected student learning? Do you know your students are learning? And if they are, how do you know? You have to be able to pinpoint evidence that is displayed in your classroom that leads you to believe the students are learning. And that's really what this EdTPA portfolio is all about. It's a portfolio that is a proof of sorts that your students are learning, that you are having a positive impact on student learning. Next, I wanted to share with you a few of the most frequently used subject-specific handbooks. Hopefully you do see your subject area on this list. Now, when selecting a subject-specific handbook for your EdTPA portfolio, you do need to make sure you're selecting the handbook that most appropriately aligns with your Grand Canyon University College of Education program that you're enrolled in, your degree program. It also needs to align with your student teaching placement that's been arranged for your student teaching. And it must align with the certification that you're seeking when you intend on seeking state certification with your state. So for example, you'll see our first one here listed is elementary education. So for a student in our Bachelor's of Elementary Education program who is student teaching in a second grade classroom, all subject areas, who seeks to be an elementary educator in his or her state, will select the Elementary Education Subject-Specific Handbook, which is a literacy EdTPA with the mathematics assessment task. A student who is in our master's program for secondary mathematics would be selecting the Secondary Mathematics Handbook. This person would also be student teaching in a high school mathematics classroom and is seeking to be certified in secondary mathematics in their state. If you're teaching high school Spanish and you're in our secondary program, then you would use the World Language Handbook. So is there anyone who is still confused about which handbook they would select to align with their program, their student teaching placement, and the certification that they're seeking? Hello, Nicole.
Hi, I was wondering because we do have two parts, which is the preschool part and the K through third part. So how do we go about picking a handbook for that?
Okay, so you're on our early education. You're in our early childhood education?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Great question. You will be working on EdTPA during both sessions, but most likely your second session is going to be working with those students who are a bit older in those primary grades. Typically what our students find is that the evidence that they compile in their second session is of greater substance and is a better demonstration of student learning, and they select to submit that evidence for the national scoring to edtpa.com.
Okay.
So you would choose the Early Childhood Handbook. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay, we have another question here from Polly.
Hi, I'm going for a dual major in elementary and special ed. So I would choose the elementary literacy and mathematics and then the special ed as well.
So it's going to be up to you. You are going to work on both pieces while you're in your student teaching, but most likely you're going to be doing your your special education session last. Most of the students in our dual program are more passionate about special education and are going to be seeking certification in special education. If that's what you're thinking, then you would probably be selecting the special education handbook to follow for submitting your evidence for the national scoring. If you think that you may be seeking just the elementary education certification and hoping to teach in an elementary classroom, then you may opt to submit your elementary education portfolio for the national scoring process. And just to be a little bit more, did that answer your question, Polly?
So basically I would be, since I am a dual major, and I am leaning more towards special ed, I would primarily just use a special ed handbook, which would get me through both the elementary and the special ed.
Yes, and you could use the elementary education handbook for your first session and special ed handbook for your second session, but you also could just follow the special education handbook for both sessions and just become a little bit more familiar with that. That would be okay as well.
Thank you.
Yep. And just to be a little bit more clear on the submission process, so when I say submit for your national scoring, throughout your student teaching placement, you're working on accumulating all of this evidence, but the official scoring is not done through Grand Canyon University. It's done through an external exam provider. Pearson is actually the group that maintains that scoring process. They have a website that is used to collect your evidence, as an e-portfolio, a cloud-based storage system. And once you've uploaded all of your items to that e-portfolio, then it can be officially scored through their national scorers. And once your portfolio has been scored by those scorers, you will receive a score back, a numerical score, and you'll have to check with your expectations for your state to find out if that is a sufficient score for passing. Okay, it looks like we have a couple more questions here. Okay, I'm having a little bit of an issue with our GoToMeeting module here. Hopefully everyone can still hear me. Okay, I think I have that resolved now. And we have one more question here from Shakira. Hi,
Yes,
Shakira.
how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm good. You were kind of going in and out a little bit when you first started, the subject of specific handbooks, and I,
I'm sorry, what was that?
teacher, I went to school. My degree was in that, but um, my degree is in elementary education, but they let me lean more English so that I can be a middle school teacher. So I didn't hear, like you said, secondary, that was for high school. So would secondary be for me as well, or no?
What grade are you going to be teaching?
7th.
Okay, for 7th, it's going to depend on the way your state does their certification. If 7th is considered a secondary grade level in your state, then you could do the secondary handbook. There is also another option that's most applicable for our Georgia students, but it can sometimes be applicable to other students as well, is there are
I'm from Georgia.
You're in Georgia? Yeah, there's middle childhood handbooks that are for those middle grades, not necessarily middle school, but for middle grades. So I do have more information on that on our professional learning network, which I'll be discussing more in just a little bit. Okay, so let's go on. I wanted to show you a little bit about the breakdown of the EdTPA portfolio. So to compile this portfolio, it's all going to be centered around a learning segment. And you may be familiar with calling this a unit or a mini unit. We call a mini unit approximately 3 to 5 lessons. That's what we're referring to when we say a learning segment. It's a collection of 3 to 5 lessons that are progressively building upon a particular area of content, subject matter. So, for example, if we're teaching about compare and contrasting using fairy tales, all 3 to 5 lessons would be using that same subject matter, and they would be progressively building upon one another. So when we say learning segment, think about that 3 to 5 lesson unit. We do need 3 to 5 distinct, fully written lesson plans, but we can chunk them together in a learning segment. And so the learning segment typically is taught over the course of a week, but it could also be taught over the course of 3 days or possibly even 2 weeks, depending upon the schedule at your particular school. And the learning segment is the feature of your portfolio. Now, when you're working on collecting the evidence for your portfolio, it's broken down into 3 tasks. And you'll also see this in your content-specific handbook. It breaks down the instructions into 3 tasks. Task 1 is planning, instruction, and assessment. So the first thing that you're going to be doing, working on task 1, is doing all of the planning for this learning segment. You'll be writing the lesson plans and preparing to teach this learning segment. And that also includes planning the assessment. Now, when you work on task 2, that will be all of the information surrounding the implementation of your learning segment. So once you've fully prepared your learning segment, you're ready to teach it or implement it. So task 2 is for instructing and engaging students in learning. But all of the evidence that you need to demonstrate engaging students in learning is surrounding your implementation of the learning segment. Then task 3 is for assessing student learning. So everything in task 3 will be focused on how you assess student learning. Are your students learning during this particular learning segment? Now, throughout all 3 tasks, the scorers are going to be looking for you to give careful attention to academic language and the analysis of your own teaching. So not only will you have to use academic language, but you'll have to give your students opportunities to use academic language, and you'll have to support them in that. And then you'll have an opportunity to analyze your planning in task 1, your implementation in task 2, and your assessment in task 3. You'll be analyzing your own teaching. And your portfolio will be documented with evidence, the candidate commentaries, the instructional artifacts, including student work, and 1 to 2 unedited video clips of teacher-student interaction. So that's video recording of you teaching the learning segment in your student teaching class. It does have to be recordings of you teaching the learning segment, not just any old lesson you're teaching. We understand that as a student teacher, you're going to be planning many lessons. You'll be doing implementation of many lessons and assessments of many lessons. But for this EdTPA portfolio, we're only interested in this one particular learning segment. Okay, it looks like we have another question here. Polly, did you have a question?
Yes, so then the 3 tasks are basically going to be documented through written and written work that I've completed, and then I just need to do a video of the actual teaching segments of the task.
Yes, you're on the right track. I'll be talking a little bit more about what evidence is expected for each piece in just a moment.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so the artifacts you submit will be judged on 5 components. And you'll see one of the components is planning, that most of your work for planning is done in task 1. They're also looking at your competency with instruction, and most of that is related to task 2. And assessment, which is mostly in task 3. But you're also being judged on analyzing teaching and academic language. Now, you need to provide evidence for analyzing teaching and academic language across all tasks. So what that means is, when you're working on task 1 planning, you're also going to be talking about maybe some of the scaffolds that you have in place to help your students with academic language. And you'll see the note here on the bottom. For our elementary education teacher candidates, we have tasks 1 through 3, and also task 4. Task 4 asks our elementary teacher candidates to demonstrate competency with instruction related to mathematics. Now, I've gathered most of this material looking at our elementary education assessment handbook. However, it's fairly consistent across all assessment handbooks. I tell you that because I don't want you to copy these guidelines and use them as a tool while you're working on your EdTPA. This is just intended to be an overview, and the component sections will stay the same, but the guidelines sometimes vary slightly from handbook to handbook. So when you're working on your EdTPA, you'll be referring to your subject-specific handbook primarily. That will be your guide to completing your EdTPA portfolio. But I've put together these little charts to help with an overview. So in all of the content handbooks, we see task 1, 2, and 3. And task 1 is always focused on planning for instruction and assessment. And we always see this task is broken down into these 5 component sections: A, B, C, D, and E. So A, we will consistently see that the first thing students will need to complete is the Context for Learning Information template. And what this is a template that asks for specific information about the student and the school classroom that you're placed at for student teaching. So it's nice that this is the first thing you're asked to complete because it allows you to get to know your students a little bit further, which is a really important part of EdTPA. When you're working on your EdTPA learning segment, you're going to be giving it a lot of careful attention, more than you would if you were just putting together some unit plans for a course that you're taking. And I say you're giving it special attention because you're really putting this learning segment together for your particular classroom students. There needs to be intentional ties to the needs of your students and the plans that you're putting together. This shouldn't just be a learning segment that you could put together and any one of your peers could teach to any one of their classes. It needs to be a learning segment that is appropriate for your particular classroom students. So the next component section of task 1 is for you to prepare your learning segment. So you may be talking with your cooperating teacher about the learning segment that you're going to be putting together. You'll identify a central focus, and the central focus is really like an overarching objective for your learning segment. You'll analyze the academic language demands, what your students will need, and you will write those 3 to 5 full lesson plans using a template of your choice. I do recommend using our GCU College of Education lesson plan template, but you really can use any lesson template as long as it includes all of the designated components. And you can see a listing of those components in your content-specific handbook under task 1. Component section C, you'll need to include all of the instructional materials that you'll use for this learning segment. D, all of the assessments that you'll use for your learning segment. And E is the planning commentary. Now, at the end of each task, you will see a commentary is required. And the best way to understand what is expected in the commentary is to think about previous courses that you've taken at GCU and essays that you've written. Commentary is like an essay-style reflection. You'll be writing about pieces that you're reflecting on, but you'll also be using citations and references to reference theories and prominent educational theorists to help support the reflections that you're making and the planning that you've put in place. So at the end of task 1 is the planning commentary, and there is a template for this that includes specific prompts. So you will be responding to the prompts throughout the commentary template, but it's important to make sure that you don't get these commentary pieces mixed up. The planning commentary goes with task 1. And then we'll see later there's an instructional commentary for task 2 and an assessment commentary for task 3. And that's consistent for whichever content-specific handbook you're using. We always do the planning commentary first. Okay, now let's take a look at task 2. Task 2 is made up of 2 component sections. First, we need the video clips. And remember, these are video clips of implementation of the learning segment. Now, before you do any video recording in your student teaching classroom, you do need to obtain permission. So we do have some permission slips that you can use. If your school already collects permission slips from the students to use video recording at the school, that helps. You'll just need to obtain a copy of those permission slips so that you can make copies of them and keep them in your records. I recommend that you keep them in your files for a year, but 6 months may be sufficient. You're not going to be turning these permission slips in to the Pearson group, but it's nice to have them just in case something does come up. So first you obtain the video permission slips, then you need to examine your plans for the learning, identify the lessons to video record, complete the video recording, and view and select clips carefully. Component section B of task 2 is the instructional commentary and additional information. The instructional commentary is your chance to respond to the prompts, analyzing your own teaching and incorporating different educational theorists and prominent authors in the education field as a way to support your analysis and reflection in this commentary. Okay, it looks like we have a question here. With special education artifacts, this will mostly come from what specific Common Core state standard? The artifacts will come from the learning segment. So artifacts are typically the student work that is produced during the implementation of the learning segment. And so that's going to be aligned with whatever Common Core state standard or whichever standard from whichever state that you have chosen to address and is documented in your lesson plan. So you're going to create a student learning objective that addresses whichever particular standard you have selected. What happens if the students we use in our assessment transfer or stop coming to school? That would be a very big problem. So what I would recommend is if one of the students that you're using in your learning segment, remember this learning segment is going to take about a week. So if one of the students leaves during that week, unfortunately, you may have to start over the next week. That would be a big problem. Or if you have a big enough group, say if you have a group of 6 students that you're using, and one student stops coming to school, you might be able to continue with just the 5. We would be able to address that on an individual basis. Another student says, do we have to inform students that we will be using their work? No. Not that I am aware of. Not heard that come up. When you're collecting their student work, you can just scan that in and you can hand it back to the student. You don't need to keep that in your files. Everything is collected as digital artifacts that you'll be submitting in a digital portfolio, an e-portfolio. Okay, let's talk about task 3. Task 3 is the assessment portion. So all of the evidence here is in regards to assessing students' learning. Determine which assessment from your learning segment you will use. So we know that when we plan a learning segment of 3 to 5 lessons, we likely will have multiple assessments that we use, whether they be formative or summative. Typically, there's a few different assessments that are used. So you're going to pick one in particular that you're going to use for task 3. Make sure that it is completed by the entire class featured in the learning segment, and it should reflect the work of individuals. So not where they're grouped together and only one person submits a assessment. That won't be allowed. Then evaluation. You'll need to determine how will you evaluate this assessment. And typically, students will use a rubric. A rubric is a pretty strong, reliable way to evaluate student assessments. Once you've selected the evaluation criteria, you can analyze the student work. Now, for the student work sample, for elementary students, we select 3 focus students. That number can vary from content-specific handbook to the next. So make sure you are referring to your handbook when you're selecting the appropriate number of focus students. But you will need to collect your student work samples and document feedback to each focus student. And that's feedback on the assessment. So that's, you may be writing on that assessment about what they did right, what they did wrong, and what they can do in the future. Or you may be giving them feedback using an audio or a video recording to capture your feedback. So you can give them feedback in written, audio, or video format. Someone has a question here. Can things be submitted via class notebook? I'm not very familiar with what that is, but if that's how your students turn in their student work and you're able to capture that in a digital file, then yes, you can use that to capture for your digital portfolio. It just has to you have to make sure it's something that you can download and keep as a digital form, not just a link to the student work. That would not be accepted. Okay, and then D is the assessment commentary. So remember, the commentary is your opportunity to respond to the prompt. You do need to include and submit the assessment that you've used, and you need to provide evidence of academic language. Now remember, task 4 is for elementary education students only. And this is for assessing students' mathematics learning. So the first component section of Task 4 is to complete the Mathematics Context for Learning Information template. That is similar to what was done in Task 1. However, it may change or it may be the same. If it's the same, you still have to fill out this template all over again. If it changes, then of course you would document the contextual information with the correct students and classroom that you're working with. B is the learning segment overview. So this is different from the learning segment done in Task 1, because with this learning segment, you don't need to write out individual lesson plans. You don't need 3 to 5 fully completed lesson plans. You only need to complete the learning segment overview template. Then C, you have to create the re-engagement lesson plan. This is a fully written lesson plan. D, collect 3 focus students' work samples. E, evaluate the effectiveness of the re-engagement lesson. So essentially this Task 4 is a plan for intervention for your math classroom. After teaching a learning segment, you determine where a particular group of students struggle. You teach them a re-engagement lesson plan, then you measure their progress, and then you make a statement as to if the re-engagement lesson plan was effective or not. Okay, I want to explain a little bit about student teaching and how EdTPA fits in with student teaching. While you are in student teaching, you'll be assigned a GCU faculty supervisor and a cooperating teacher. The GCU faculty supervisor will come to evaluate you a minimum of 4 times, and they will use a specific evaluation tool. And the score that you earn on this evaluation tool will become a portion of your grade for the student teaching course. This is all done separate from EdTPA. You do take online courses for student teaching. There are particular requirements of online coursework. You need to participate in the discussion forums. There is a teacher work sample, which is like a portfolio that students will be working on. However, since you're going to be doing the EdTPA portfolio, you will not be doing the teacher work sample. So you will work with your instructor to follow the modified student teaching submissions in lieu of the teacher work sample. The modified student teaching submissions, that's a chart that we've created to help you keep track of what to be doing each week so that you can progress towards completing your EdTPA portfolio. You also have to do lesson planning, reflections, evaluations with your cooperating teacher and faculty supervisor, and documentation of hours. As you know, student teaching is a full-time commitment, and you do have to document your hours each day, every day, all week. So the modified student teaching submissions, you will need to still submit weekly discussion and participation. You can participate in modified submission tasks. You'll submit the modified submission deliverables to your online course instructor, and your instructor will help monitor to make sure you are working on these modified student teaching submissions. Another tool we have to help you keep track of your progress towards completion is the EdTPA Personal Teacher Candidate Timeline to Submission. This is just a picture of the timeline here, but I do have a timeline for you on our Professional Learning Network, which I'll be showing you in just a moment. A little bit about academic language. Academic language is the language of the discipline. So whichever subject area you're teaching, there'll be specific academic language that you and your students will need to participate in the content learning. We know that academic language is used for oral and written purposes. Some ways we understand language demands. Students participate in learning tasks: reading, writing, listening, and/or speaking, demonstrate, or performing. So when we think about the academic language that our students need to learn, we can think about these questions. What do they know? What can they do? What can they use language to demonstrate? So think about the language demands that students need to understand to express their content learning. This could be vocabulary, language functions, syntax, and discourse. So as we're thinking about the language demands, there is a tool for you to review the language demands of EdTPA. In the back of your content-specific handbook, you'll find your content-specific glossary. You should be referring to this glossary to help understand the terms that are used so that you can appropriately address each one listed. Okay, so you may be thinking about what's next. We have a few resource sites for you to become familiar with. The first one listed is edtpa.com. This is the site that's used for EdTPA registration, where you will register for your e-portfolio. It's called the Pearson e-portfolio. You can also look at submission and reporting dates, and you can look at resources for EdTPA candidates. EdTPA has also created this Vimeo site where they have housed 36 videos that you can watch. Some of them are particularly helpful. I've seen some videos where they're interviewing students who have already completed and passed EdTPA and are talking about their strategies and what they learned. And the last site here listed is pln.gcu.edu. That's a site created by the College of Education here at Grand Canyon University, and we do use it to help support you in your student teaching. This is just a picture here of our professional learning network. You can always navigate here by going to pln.gcu.edu. You are already a member, so you log in with the email address that you have on file with the university. Complete your personal profile, connect with relevant groups, post into group discussions, check the calendar for events, comment on PLN news updates, visit the resources space to find helpful materials and links specific for EdTPA. So we do encourage you to review the PLN resources, particularly the EdTPA resources housed within the PLN site. Make the appropriate selection for your content-specific assessment handbook. Access the assessment handbook for your content area. Familiarize yourself with the handbook and the rubrics. The rubrics are included in the handbook. Become familiar with filming and reflecting. You don't want the first time you film to be for your EdTPA portfolio. You want to make sure you get comfortable with using video recording. Prepare to register on Pearson's site for the Pearson e-portfolio. Begin planning with your EdTPA personal teacher candidate timeline to submission. and attend ongoing GCU EdTPA Support webinars. We also have recorded webinars on the PLN. You can get ready for your EdTPA work by registering for your ePortfolio, reviewing our PLN resources, and speak with your field experience counselor to ensure the appropriate subject-specific EdTPA assessment for you and in alignment with your program. As student teaching begins, you'll want to get started right away filling out the Context for Learning information template. Talk to your cooperating teacher about EdTPA. Obtain signed video recording permission forms. Someone made a comment about our groups page. We are still in the middle of doing a few updates right now with our professional learning network. Over the summer is when we make some updates and changes. So if you're seeing something that might be confusing, just check back as we get a little closer to the start of the semester. As a reminder, we will be sending out invites for upcoming support course workshops and webinars via email. And PLN viewing and posting is available any time of day or night. And your peers in New York, Wisconsin, and Georgia, who will all be working on this EdTPA portfolio with you along the way, can be contacted on the PLN. So for your EdTPA support, make sure you learn the skills of EdTPA. That is a workshop course to prepare for EdTPA. That is the Performance Assessment Skills for Teachers workshop course. You will be receiving an email prior to student teaching with your access to this course workshop. It is housed within our professional learning network. If you haven't been invited to it yet, don't worry. We will be sending out the invites all summer. Further support can be obtained through your field experience counselor, our clinical practice mentors, or the clinical practice specialist, Tracy Vasquez, that is myself. And you can also submit an EdTPA inquiry ticket through our professional learning network. So that is our EdTPA preview orientation. Thank you for attending. We had to go through those last slides a little more quickly than I would have liked because I wanted to make sure to reserve some time for questions. So please, if you have a question, please raise the hand icon next to your name or type in the questions box below. Hello, Polly.
Hi, I am going for elementary and special ed degree, so will I still have to go and complete task number 4?
No. If you are going to be completing the dual degree, what we found is most of those teacher candidates are going to be seeking certification in special education and seeking a position in special education. So if that's you, you're probably going to be following the special education handbook and using that for your official submission. for national scoring. So if that's the case, you can use the special ed handbook in both sessions. In your elementary, you can still use the special ed handbook. You'll just need to be a little creative in some ways that you're applying it. But just keep in mind that that's just kind of your practice round. You're going to be following it in your special education placement to collect the evidence for your official submission to Pearson.
Thank you.
Yep. Nicole? Oh, Nicole, it looks like you are self-muted. There you go.
Hello. Okay.
Hi.
I was wondering, because I'm a pre-K teacher, I was wondering if you thought that pre-kindergarten would be an okay choice to complete the EdTPA at that level.
It could be. So you're saying you're a pre-K teacher now, and so then when you do your primary grade, you're going to be just a student teacher?
Yes.
Okay. So in your case, you probably have a very good understanding of those pre-K students' needs, and you've probably
Yes.
gotten to know them pretty well. So in your case, I do think you would probably do a much better job working with them, because a big part of this EdTPA is how well you know your students and their needs, and you're planning to address their needs. So you'll probably do a pretty good job with those pre-K students. So in that case, you're probably going to want to submit that one for scoring.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, someone has asked, what is the EdTPA inquiry ticket? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let me show you what that is. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen here. This is our professional learning network that I showed you earlier, a picture of. If you go to the groups icon and click on the EdTPA group space, you'll see that the information is organized here. There's an introduction to EdTPA, which is a recorded version of the webinar that you're on today. Then the EdTPA assessment handbooks. And number 4 here is submit an EdTPA related question to the College of Education with the EdTPA inquiry request ticket. If you click on that ticket, you'll see that the form asks you for a few pieces of information: your name, position, ID, phone number, email, question, and description. So when you fill that out, that will come to the College of Education, and we will be able to review the nature of your question and assign that to someone who can best help address your question. So it does take about 24 to 48 hours, but it ensures that you get the support that you need. So if you have a question that cannot be answered by reviewing this EdTPA group space, then you will just submit an EdTPA inquiry request ticket. Okay, I see a few other questions about which subject-specific handbook to use. I don't really want to speak too generally about that on the call because it can be a very individualized decision. If you're not sure about which handbook to use, I do encourage you to speak with your field experienced counselor. And if you still don't get the answer that you need, or you're not 100% sure, please submit an EdTPA inquiry request ticket and we'll be able to address your question on an individual basis. Someone asked about the EdTPA acknowledgement form. You should see that here, EdTPA acknowledgement. That will be submitted. You can submit that to your counselor, or you can submit it to edtpa@gcu.edu. I'll send that here. Send that to you all here. Okay, if there's no other questions, I thank you all for joining me today, and I wish you the best of luck in your semester. Have a wonderful afternoon. Take care. Bye-bye.